pleasure to introduce Kevin Deane, who is a lecturer in international development at the University of Northampton. In addition to that, Kevin was a PhD student jointly supervised by myself and by Deborah Johnson at the School of Oriental and African Studies. So he's going to be presenting his work on value chains and fish for sex in relations to structural HIV/AIDS risk. So I'll hand over to Kevin and say thank you in advance. Kevin.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. So, as Justin says, I'm going to present some findings from my PhD. You can see on the front slide here that this is supported by a range of different institutions. So, what I'm going to do today is a number of things. As you can see, the title of my presentation is Fish for Sex, a Special Case, Mobility, Local Value Chains, and HIV. So, I'll start off by just providing some of the background to the study and also some brief definitions. I'll then introduce the study site and the fieldwork methods, and then obviously my findings and some conclusions and a future research agenda that's coming out of my PhD findings. So firstly, I think it's a good place to start is to actually define, what do we mean when we say the term fish for sex? So here we can see a definition from a well-known article by Deane and Merton, which essentially emphasizes the fact that this is about the relationship between fishermen and fish sellers, in which female fish sellers or fish traders gain access to fish from the fishermen through sexual interactions. This review by Deane and Merton sort of suggested that this practice is observed in many sub-Saharan African countries. They highlight, I think, three kind of main explanations to what's driving these sorts of interactions. The first explanation is around sort of what they term miserabilism. So this idea this is a kind of poverty-driven narrative that's underpinning this practice. They then also touch upon this idea that this is a kind of institutional economic interpretation. This relates to minimizing transaction costs in a market where there's imperfect information. So if you're a female fish trader, you can gain access to fish in a market where these are not necessarily widely known. And finally, that their own kind of interpretation or view on what's driving this practice is a kind of what they term a socio-institutional explanation, which is basically looking at the modernization of kind of pre-existing sexual networking practices. Now, I'm going to kind of build on this approach by suggesting that actually what we need to look at alongside this is the structure of the value chain. And also, I'm going to broaden this analysis out and see, does this kind of thing occur in other value chains? What we also see within literature is that the fishing industry is, to a large degree, sort of stigmatized. This is seen as a practice that is very, very much focused in this fishing industry. And again, I'm hoping to kind of broaden this analysis out and also suggest this isn't necessarily this isn't a practice related to the specific character of the fishing industry, but as I said, something to do with the structure of the value chain. So having defined what we mean by fish for sex, I thought it was also a good opportunity to define what we mean by a value chain. Again, here's, I think, a fairly comprehensive definition that you can see on the screen. Broadly speaking, the value chain refers to a kind of map of the flow of a particular good from the production right the way through to end consumption. And it's an analytical approach that's really used to kind of pursue two different research agendas. Firstly, how are these value chains organized, who organizes them, and what are the kind of powers involved? And secondly, and related, and I think probably the most important area of research is how are the gains from the value chain distributed across the different participants? And I'm sure you've all heard statements such as, for every cup of coffee sold in a coffee shop for £3, the coffee farmer gets, 1p or 5p of that cup. That's the kind of statement that derives from this analysis of how the gains are distributed across the value chain. So just to help you visualize, this is an example of a value chain. This is from Tanzania, and it's the maize value chain. And you can see that at each different level we have the connections and the linkages between different participants in this chain, different sizes of producers. We have traders, we have millers, and right the way through to a range of different consumption markets, be that international markets or be that domestic consumption. Later on today, I'm going to actually talk about what I'm calling local value chains, which is I guess, a small segment of that value chain, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how complex value chains can be for just one commodity. I also thought it was important to distinguish between, I guess, two value chains that are discussed in the literature. And this is important when we're thinking about how power is distributed through the chain and where power rests and the reasons underpinning that. So firstly we have, you can see here, producer-driven commodity chains. This is when the value chain is organised by I guess, the owners of the intellectual property of the producers of a good. And this applies to a range of certainly technological products. Think about the way the value chain for the iPhone is organised from the US, but is manufactured or passes through a number of hands across the globe. We then have buyer-driven commodity chains, and I think a good example of this is the coffee value chain. This is a primary product that's produced in developing countries, and again, the value chain is all organised by international traders and international buyers. Each product will have its own specificities in terms of how the value chain is both structured and organised. So I think at this stage it's understandable you're kind of thinking, what's this got to do with structural drivers? And I think these are kind of some of my initial observations when thinking through how to link this introduction with my study. So, value chains have a structure. So if we're interested in structural drivers, this is a good starting point. And also, as I've hinted in the last couple of slides, value chains are structured by a range of different factors, such as what's being produced, where the good is being produced, who's producing it, and also how gender relations and how power relations shape the nature of the value chain and also the distribution of gains. And hopefully those of you who are interested in structural drivers will begin to see that a number of these themes speak to the broader structural drivers literature. That's just a brief background and very, very brief literature review and some definitions. I think before I go ahead and introduce the project and the methods, I think it's worth saying that actually my initial research aim was more focused on exploring the relationship between population mobility and HIV risk. This theme around value chains was something, I guess, an unexpected finding that grew out of the project. So some of my methods are more around looking at mobility, but I thought it was worth giving you all an overview of actually what I did in the field so that you can see where some of this information is coming from. A very brief theoretical background. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this definition of what structural drivers actually are. And I think it's one of the best definitions there are of a difficult concept to actually capture neatly in a definition. So this is really my starting point, thinking about sort of core social processes and arrangements, and that's really how I personally would view a value chain. The approach I took, the way I operationalised this definition, was to take a materialist approach. And the quote here, I think Justin actually helped me talk through, so I don't want to take complete credit for it. But this is really thinking about how engaging in economic activities and specific livelihoods and the associated lifestyles they bring influences sexual behaviour and HIV risk. And it was this lens that enabled me to kind of address not just risk behaviours associated with mobility, but also to explore the issue further. So I'm not sure that my study site needs too much introduction, but this is where I conducted my fieldwork over around a 5 to 6 month period in Kasese ward in Mwanza region, and the fieldwork was conducted in 2011. So this is an overview of actually what I did while I was in the field, and I guess the main component of the field, it was a three-phased qualitative project. In phase one, I attempted to identify the mobile groups that I was going to study through a range of exploratory focus groups. In phase two, we then did a focus group with of the selected mobile groups, which were maize traders, dagar sellers, and mobile farmers. And we did some process mapping just to understand what's involved in engaging in this economic activity. What are the reasons that you go to certain places? What do you do while you're away? And we also included some questions about sexual behaviour. That was just at a kind of general level. And then in phase three, we then did some in-depth interviews with a small subsample of each focus group to kind of say, well, look, we've discussed what happens in general during this economic process, but what's your own experience of that? As we went through the process, I kind of realised that there were a couple of additional themes that were emerging. and so we added a couple of extra phases on towards the end, phases 4A and B. We did a couple of focus groups around exploring local sexual norms, and also some further interviews with, you can see here, with tomato sellers and tomato middlemen, as it had already begun to be clear that part of the risk that mobile groups were experiencing was related to value chains, and so we kind of extended the analysis while we were still in the field. So when we were discussing risk behaviours with our mobile groups, we encountered kind of common themes that you hear and read in the literature, such as, this idea that I was away, I was separated from my spouse, so I had to have a partner while I was away. But we also heard from certainly maize traders and farmers, and in particular, that some of the risk they're experiencing was transactional purposes. And in relation to maize traders, we had a discussion around the role of giving informal credit to either street sellers or to end consumers, and how that could sometimes lead to sexual interactions. And so while I was in the field, I really began to kind of reconsider this mobility narrative, and that was where the interest in how value chains shape these interactions came from. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk you through the structure of the three main value chains that I studied: the maize chain, the dagar chain, and the tomato chain. In the first chain you can see here is the maize chain. The key to all of these three diagrams, in black we have the key participants, and I guess these are the most commonly observed participants and the gender of each participant. Of course, not every node in the chain is fulfilled by one gender, so when we encountered exceptions, these are sort of highlighted in grey. So we can see here that mobile traders, we encountered some female mobile traders, but they were really the exception rather than the rule. The black arrows denote the flow of the product, and again, if the arrow's in black, that's the kind of most common flow of the product. If the arrow's in grey, that's a less common flow. The green dotted line, this is, I guess, the most important thing about these diagrams, and this denotes what I'm terming a gendered interface. This is basically an interface where predominantly men sell to predominantly women, or vice versa. I guess this is the most important thing when we're thinking about how does the structure of the value chain influence sexual interactions. So one of the final thing, when I've highlighted a box in red, that denotes the participants in my study. So you can see the lens I'm using. In this case, we primarily spoke to the mobile male traders, but this enabled, through a discussion with them about what their economic activity involved, we could then map out the chain, because we were clearly asking them, who do you buy your maize from, who do you sell your maize to, etc. So that's the first value chain. So we have one gendered interface in the maize chain, in which a degree of power is expressed between mobile maize traders and either female street sellers or female end consumers. So this is the dagar chain. This is again, only a segment of the broader chain, as the maize chain was. And we can see, even at the local level, this is a far more complex chain, a number of different additional stages in the chain, and also, I guess, a number of other different participants, different gendered participants. So, the fish flows through sort of male fishermen to female lakeshore traders, then via mobile middlemen to either, again, street retail sellers or to end consumers. And I think what's worth pointing out here is that within this chain, and again, this is only a small segment of the overall sort of national international chain, we can see that there are actually three gendered interfaces across this value chain in comparison to just one in the maize chain. So this is the final chain, I guess a bit more of a straightforward chain. This is the tomato chain. And again, we can see that often farmers sell their tomatoes to mobile traders who are almost without exception male, and then the male traders sell tomatoes on to female street sellers who then sell to end consumers who are also female. I think it's also worth pointing out that a number of these products, particularly tomatoes and dagar, are really viewed as female commodities. That they're female goods that are bought by women in the household. Men don't necessarily go to the market to buy these products. I think anybody, my colleagues in Mwanza will certainly have been familiar with turning up at, for fieldwork in Kisesa in the morning and seeing either the farmers or the mobile traders coming into town on their bikes carrying large sacks of tomatoes. These are the three value chains that I looked at within my study, and hopefully it's kind of clear that each one does involve this interface where we have sort of highly gendered roles within the value chain. To leave us enough time for discussion and for questions, I'm not going to present you kind of all of my evidence, but I just thought I'd pick out 3 quotes from each of the value chains that I think illustrate the different ways in which economic and gendered power is expressed. The first example is from the tomato chain, and here we have a male tomato trader who's, to a certain sense, extending informal credit to a street seller. So he turns up every morning at her bench, gives her a basket of tomatoes, and then the expectation is that she has the day to sell those tomatoes and then pays them back at the end of the day or the next day when he comes to deliver a fresh basket. Now, clearly selling tomatoes on the street is a fairly fragile business, and it doesn't always lead to a profit every single day. And so, when the street seller is unable to pay the tomato trader back, there's potential certainly for the relationship to begin, for sex to come into play. Of course, it doesn't happen all the time, but this opens up a space for this to happen. So the first theme is around extending informal credit. The second quote that I'm showing today is from a male maize trader. Now, we have to bear in mind that this is clearly qualitative information that we're interpreting, but that the male maize trader, to a certain degree, emphasising that this is more about female agency. He's a bit of an unwitting victim in this process. So he describes a female customer kind of borrowing maize from him up front a number of times. And then eventually she says that she can't actually pay it back, but she's kind of already started to establish this relation and this inference that this might lead to sex being exchanged or used to repay the debt. This is being framed by the male maize trader as something that the female customer is instigating to a certain extent. The third quote, I think, is the opposite view, the quote from the maize chain. And this is around a male trader using and exploiting this situation to his own ends. So the female fish retail seller is saying that, he kind of, he lends me the goods up front, and then he just says, don't worry about it, pay me another time. And then later on uses that situation to almost extract or to coerce to a certain extent sex from the retail fish seller. So I think it contrasts nicely with the previous quote where the male maize trader is kind of talking about or framing this in terms of female agency, whereas this quote from the fish chain is almost framing this in a way of saying, well, this is actually more around male agency and the use of the exploitation of this gendered interface. So, of course, you'll, to a certain extent, hopefully trust me that there is other evidence supporting the analysis here. I can assure you there is, and hopefully this will be published at some point in more detail. But this is just a kind of summary of how sexual interactions were related to participation in the value chains. So I guess one of the key thing was for repayment of informal credit, and informal credit is extended to both street sellers and also end consumers. We also had some female traders or female retail sellers talking to us about this is an opportunity to increase their capital or an opportunity to get a good deal, which echoes some of the themes in the fish for sex literature. I think it's important to note here that these interactions are very complex, they're very nuanced, there are different degrees of agency in each interaction, and as I say here, they're instigated by different actors, and to that end, they will certainly involve varying degrees of coercion and of power expressed. Just some initial conclusions then on the role of local value chains and HIV risk. So I guess the argument I'm putting forward here is that these sexual interactions are shaped specifically by the gender structure of the value chain, and I've identified the gendered interfaces in which mainly men sell to mainly women, or vice versa. And these interfaces create the space where both economic and gendered power can be expressed to coerce sexual interactions, or creating the space for transactional sexual interactions to occur. Now, clearly, sex won't always be involved. We spoke to tomato middlemen that encountered a situation where a female trader couldn't pay him back, and he decided to take her bench instead. So sex isn't always involved, but it creates the opportunity, the space for it to be. Yeah, and also finally, the gendered nature of these value chains, the roles that different participants fulfill are also then further related to broader socio-economic inequalities and structures such as gender relations, which I know the STRIVE project certainly focuses on. So hopefully I've, to a certain degree, convinced you that this isn't a phenomenon that is limited only to the fishing industry, but it's worth, I guess, putting forward some tentative suggestions as to why it's such a commonly known phenomena, why this term fish for sex has arisen. And I guess to a certain degree, when we looked at the three value chains, we could see that even in a short value chain there were more gendered interfaces in this value chain. So that might be one of the reasons why fish for sex is a term that has become more popular. Certainly we also need to think about, well, what are the different factors involved in shaping how power is distributed across the chain? And certainly a couple of key actors in the fish value chain I certainly think dominate and capture most of the gains in that chain. Firstly, we have the fishermen themselves. This is where the commodity originates. And in studies that you read about, fishermen selling in fishing villages to female fish traders, we can see in many situations that the primary economic activity of those villages is fishing. This is the primary source of value. So fishermen in this chain certainly hold a huge amount of power. We then can also think about the mobile traders. Again, fish originates in quite specific geographical places. To enable the goods, the products to be distributed more widely, it's necessary for there to be mobile traders who form that link between the source of the commodity and markets further away from the sources from the lakes. And again, these larger traders are primarily male, and they again will hold a huge amount of power through this value chain. So again, thinking about why is fish for sex such a common term, we need to think about, the nature of the value chain, the specificities of the value chain that are related to the source of the good and to the geographical location of markets. Okay, so I'm nearly there. So, some final conclusions from my presentation, my analysis. Firstly, I'm certainly arguing that fish for sex is not an isolated phenomena. There are evidence that similar sexual interactions occur in other value chains, and this is because of the gender structure of each value chain. However, thinking back to my overall aims of the initial research, there clearly is a role for mobility in linking different nodes of the value chain. So mobility is still an important factor, but plays a different role in shaping risk in this context. And therefore, there are a number of research questions that arise from my analysis here. To what extent does this apply to other value chains outside of maize and tomato? And I had some discussions when I was in Mwanza this summer about other value chains this could apply to, such as the pineapple value chain. See risk experienced in a similar way in other value chains. What's the kind of frequency of these sexual interactions? Is this something that has a broader structural drivers and HIV community we should be worried about? And also, is the value of the transaction is that important in shaping the frequency that this occurs? So those are my final conclusions. I just have on the next slide some references that you can consult to check anything that I've said in this presentation. And as I say, hopefully at some point this will be published in a more coherent form. Okay, well, but thanks for giving me this opportunity, and thanks for listening, and I look forward to some questions.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So Justin Parkhurst here again. To ask Kevin, in your final conclusion slide, you talked about the frequency, and I would think that could be a very important aspect of the risk just by looking at your different value chains. Obviously, if a large number of individuals are involved, so for example, if you have small scale, fishermen and a large number of retailers at the small scale, you're just going to have simply more opportunities for those gendered interfaces rather than if you have, a single maize trader who buys from a very large number or farmers have very large holdings. So I think that is a very important aspect of it. I also wonder, Kevin, if there's any literature on fishermen in particular, and if there's anything about the lifestyle of fishing that might make them a bit different. Maybe it's a more risk-prone or risk-seeking behavior, or if it's a particularly dangerous activity, if the dangers of fishing might offset health-seeking behavior. Kathy Campbell's written a lot about that in terms of mine workers in southern Africa, for example, how the risk of their day-to-day life means that health messages or health promotion messages really don't resonate as well.
Yeah, it's about the specific nature of the value chain. So certainly we have a large number of fishermen probably selling to not a huge amount of flakes or traders. So we have quite a concentration in certain roles. And if somebody within that network was infected, then that they have, the potential to have sex with quite a large number of people. So we have the sexual networks are quite concentrated at certain points. In relation to the fishing industry, I think you're absolutely right. And as you were asking that question, I was automatically thinking of, mine workers and truck drivers. And I think there are a number of parallels with certainly the fishing case. Very male-dominated industries, groups of young men spending, certain periods of time away from home. So again, we link back to the mobility narrative. I think there is a certain amount of danger, certainly with regard. I think they're fished at night. So men are going out on the lake at night, and also just the general environment around fishing villages. So fishing villages attract women to come and set up temporary food stands, or certainly to provide sexual services as well. So there are a lot of parallels with the fisherman case study, and also with some of the reasons that lead truck drivers and mine workers into risky behaviour. So you're certainly right to make that parallel.
Okay, we've got a couple of other questions that have been typed into the chat. So one is from Deborah Johnston at SOAS, who asks, what do your findings mean for interventions that try to empower women by promoting their activities in certain value chains? Okay,
I think that's a really good question, and perhaps there was another slide I could have put in when I was sort of talking about value chains, and that's around, what are the strategies that people or countries even should use to capture more value in the chain. And actually, we have a number of different strategies. Firstly, we have a strategy around upgrading the value chain, so moving from a lower value good to a higher value good. And we also have, a second key strategy, which is trying to move up the value chain. So if you're a street seller, the way to capture more value from that chain, the way to increase your income would be to try and move up the chain, in this case, to become a mobile trader. So in terms of policies and interventions around women's economic empowerment, and I guess specifically we're thinking about microfinance, I would suggest that this analysis leads us to the conclusion that these kind of policies may not actually help. We're investing in or lending to women who are already in quite vulnerable positions. We're lending to women who are engaging in quite fragile economic activities, so that there's no guarantee that, if you extend credit to a female street seller, that's going to significantly improve her business. It's certainly unlikely to increase her chances of moving up the value chain into a different position. And even if that was the case, then being a mobile female trader comes with a different set of risks that would need to be looked at. But my conclusions from this analysis would be that microfinance and women's economic empowerment in relation to the value chains and kind of the informal sector is a fairly limited way to go.
Okay, I'm sure that might provoke some interesting discussion or questions. I don't know if others want to come back to that. There's a couple of questions from Daniel Nayato, forgive me if I mispronounce any names, who asks what the implications of your findings on value chains are for gender inequality and HIV prevention. So kind of a similar question or related. And Daniel also asked if you know the marital status for those involved in these chains.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for your question. I hope things are good in Mwanza. So in terms of the marital status, most of the participants that we spoke to in this study were married. So the general ages of the traders we were talking to were kind of late 20s to mid-30s. And, clearly these are women that are also not only juggling street selling, but also juggling looking after children and a household as well. So, most of these study participants were married. In terms of implications for gender relations, I guess going back to some of my earlier slides, the structure of these value chains, the highly gendered nature of each, I guess, role within the value chain is itself related to the broader gender inequalities. That's why it's predominantly women that sit around on the side of the street and sell small quantities of either maize, tomatoes, or dagar, or often a combination. And that's why it's primarily men who are the wealthier mobile traders. And to give you an idea of the sort of people we were talking to, the mobile maize traders were going on 1.5 to 2 buying trips a month, and in some cases buying 300 or 400 sacks of maize from rural areas and bringing them back. So these are men who are working with a reasonable amount of capital. So I certainly think, and this is where I think this really fits in with the Structural Drivers Project, is that the manifestations of these value chains is linked and rooted in broader gender inequalities.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. There was also another question that Annie has posed, or just perhaps a reflection on how your study did grow out of mobility interest, and I think Annie notes that mobility is often ignored in many intervention designs. So based on what you've seen and what you've learned, how you might reflect on interventions in this kind of part of the world, and whether mobility itself needs to be addressed, or can it be addressed in terms of the current approaches to HIV prevention.
Okay, that's a really good question. I think what my study does, and I think also actually the other findings and the other narrative I've developed around mobility, is that I'm not sure that isolating kind of mobility as a variable on its own is a fruitful way forward. I think the analysis, the value chain analysis I've presented here, I think shows that mobility, transactional sex, and the structure of value chains are all overlapping and interlinked. I think isolating the mobility component in this situation is not really a fruitful way forward. Whether we should want to limit mobility or not, I think it's a difficult question to answer, and I don't actually have a firm answer for that. But it's certainly something that's discussed in the broader migration literature. If we're thinking about Amartya Sen's view of development as freedom, then certainly trying to prevent people or encourage them not to move would contradict that kind of view of development. We also have arguments from the World Bank saying that migration is a vital part of economic development in terms of helping get the right people with the right skills in the right place. Almost that the horse has bolted. I mean, we're seeing with the current Ebola outbreak that actually mobility plays a really important part in how diseases are spread. So I think there are a lot of questions around whether we should be targeting the mobility. Just going back to the question that you asked earlier, in terms of looking at the experiences of truck drivers and mine workers, who are two of the most commonly discussed mobile groups, and this certainly relates to the work that Kathy Campbell has done. A lot of the interventions wouldn't necessarily be around the mobility of these groups. The interventions that she's certainly suggesting are around working conditions, employment conditions, and also, addressing broader inequalities that lead, prostitutes to set up camps around either truck stops or mines. So I think there are certainly broader interventions that need to be looked at that address unequal gender relations in a broader social way. And I think there are also elements to do with, working conditions, employment conditions, and security that also could be possible sites of intervention, and that aren't directly linked to the sort of the kind of standard being away narrative. This idea that people can't possibly go for a couple of months away from their partner without having sex, or that being mobile somehow gives you more opportunities to engage in extramarital interactions.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think just to follow up, I don't think Annie's question necessarily referred to the idea of limiting mobility, but certainly what your analysis and some other publications that have already come out have shown is that idea of mobility as a variable, as an independent variable that's often included in surveys or in correlation analyses is not necessarily sophisticated enough, because mobility means many different things and has many different aspects, and really what you need to look at are kind of what happens when people move for different reasons, and your approach, I think, is one way to help unpack that complexity. We do have another question now from Christine McClanahan, if I pronounce it correctly, who said who reflected that you had said you added on understanding local sexual norms. So she's asking how did that contribute to your value chain analysis and your conclusions? I guess that understanding of local sexual norms.
I guess what had come out of the first three phases were certainly themes around transactional sex, and my colleague Joyce Wamoy in Mwanza has worked extensively on this, but also this local term for informal credit called Mali Kauli, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And so I wanted to really unpack and explore what does this term actually mean, and how do the local community operationalise it? Is this just related to specific segments of the value chain? So is it just an informal credit relation between a trader and a street seller, a commercial, I guess, credit relation, or is this also just related to broader extension of credit, such as between the maize, the mobile trader and the street seller? And also to understand a bit more about transactional sex. I was certainly not necessarily expecting to encounter that issue. So that was really why I decided to just do a couple of focus groups, one with men only and one with women only, just to kind of ask them a bit more about these interactions. So it gave me a bit more, I guess it's not directly related to what I presented today, but it just gave me a bit more of an underpinning around the way that these informal credit relations work.
We have a comment from Tinashe Figu saying thank you, and your work's very useful in looking at the broader economic context that shapes the gender relations that facilitate transactional sex. And I think many of us would share that thanks. One other, Daniel asks also in the Daga value chain, could we say that men are more vulnerable? I'm not sure exactly more vulnerable in what ways, but do you have any reflection on that, the vulnerability of men in that value chain?
I guess this kind of reflects on the two different views on agency that I presented in my quotes. Arguably, if we're thinking about men having control of a valuable resource and women trying to compete for access to it, that arguably could be one way we could understand sort of male vulnerability to HIV. However, we certainly need to keep in mind, and I think that the fish for sex definition that I showed at the front emphasises that this is often used in a kind of coercive way by men. But yeah, that there could be a degree of vulnerability due to the sort of concentration of power and people trying to access this good. But that's just off the top of my head. But that could be one way you could think about male vulnerability.
Okay.
And just to add in, we hear you have to interpret these comments by certainly by looking at who's saying what. So one repeated thing that I found when we were talking about transactional sex in the study, that it was often men were telling you about how women almost kind of trick them or put them into a situation through building this relationship to a situation where sex can occur. Whereas obviously, when women were talking about transactional relations, they were clearly talking about this being rooted in the male expression of power. So we get two different sides of a coin presented throughout the study, and we had to be careful when we interpreted those.
Okay, no, thank you, Kevin. I mean, I think obviously yours, as you said, was a qualitative study, but I think it's a really good illustration of the insights that good qualitative work can do, and potentially link to more quantitative analysis as well. I mean, speaking of frequency of these interactions and looking at those nature, it really shows how these methods can work together, I think, to help provide a more rich and balanced understanding.
Yeah, this is Jerry from Mwanza, and I just wanted to request Kevin to expand a little bit in terms of the correlations, especially in terms of the framework that probably used. And then two, coming from, Bourdieu's point of view, where you have different forms of capital and which you can basically transform them into economic capital. I'm thinking about, the women, and there has been articles where it has been reported, specifically, for example, from Tanzania, that women see sex as a resource that they can transform into an economic sort of value. So I don't know what are your comments on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thanks. I think that those are two really valuable comments. I think that the way that I'm thinking about power relations, I think we have inequities in both in relation to gendered power, certainly male power being expressed over women, but we also have economic power at the same time. So if you think back to the male maize traders as a good example, or in fact all the mobile traders, these are people that are more wealthy, are working with a much higher level of capital than the street sellers that they're selling to. So there's certainly economic power expressed in that relation. Wealthy people selling to less well-off people, certainly. And because of the gender nature of this relationship, that also brings in this extra layer of unequal and gendered power. So I guess I'm thinking about power in two different ways. And they're overlapped and they're interlinked, and I guess almost impossible to, in a qualitative study and in this exploratory study, to separate out. And that perhaps is something that could be explored in the future research. What's more important in this interaction? Is it the economic power or is it the gendered power? So I think that was a really good insight. And also your comment about women seeing sex as a resource, this absolutely speaks to a lot of the work that Joyce has been doing on this work, thinking that the phrases such as women's bodies as shops, and absolutely this is absolutely involved in shaping these kind of interactions.
Okay, we also have another comment that's come in from Ritu Nanda, who's working in India, who just comments that I think is making the comment that there's similarities with truck drivers and fishermen in India as well, commenting on how young male helpers of truck drivers and fishermen there show particular vulnerability to HIV as well. So I think that's a comment just to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's certainly, thinking about truck drivers, that there's a fairly large literature that looks at truck driving and sexual behaviour across almost every continent. I've seen studies from Bolivia, studies from the US, a number of different sub-Saharan African countries, India, narratives from China and other parts of Asia. So absolutely, this is a fairly well studied group of people, and certainly a vulnerable group of people to HIV infection. I mean, I'd be interested as well if anybody there is certainly anybody working in India has heard of sort of transactional relations related to these kind of value chains. I'd be really interested to hear about that. I've scoured the literature, and I can find an article, I think from about 97, that looks at itinerant traders and HIV risk, but there's not much formal work has been done on looking at this sort of transactional phenomenon through the lens of the value chain. So if anybody comes across anything, I'd certainly be interested to read it.
Okay, well, I think that's perhaps a good place to wrap up. I don't see too many other questions. Someone shout if I'm missing a hand. I don't want to ignore anyone. But, clearly there is a lot more work to be done in this area. But I think these are providing really interesting and novel ways of approaching aspects of structural drivers, which I think many of us would agree is an area that requires more thinking and more novel methodologies and approaches. So it leaves me, I think, to conclude simply by thanking everyone for joining, and of course thanking our speaker, Kevin, for a great presentation. I think we all look forward to, if you do publish some of these findings in further form, we'd love to hear about it.